Good morning, and welcome to our conversation on gender equality and gender equity. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get right into it. I'd love to take questions from the audience. I think each of you have been given a card. As we're talking, please feel free to write your question down on that card. You'll get points for handwriting, because I'll have to read them. As soon as we finish the first part of our conversation, which will be moderated by me, I'll then turn to the questions that you have submitted. So I encourage you to do that. We'll send someone around to grab those cards from you in the middle of our conversation. So Anne, welcome.
Thank you, Soledad. Nice to be here.
Thank you. What does gender equality mean? What does gender equity mean? Give me your definitions.
So I was really stunned a few years ago to have somebody point out the difference between those terms. And this person described it as you have a fence and there's a beautiful view on the other side. And you put out a step stool that's a foot off the ground, and various people can step up on that. And if you're tall enough, that'll be enough to help you see over. But if you're short, you're still looking at the fence. That's equality. Everybody has the same step stool. Equity is about giving the shorter person what they need to get the view. And to me that was so important, because I think that there are, certainly in the case of women, in the case of a lot of different groups of people, we have some work to do to help everybody get the same view and have the same opportunity. So I think that that's what it means. It means making sure, equity means making sure that every person has the same opportunity, and whatever they need to help them get that is what we need to do for each other.
Can we have conversations about gender equality without actually dealing with gender equity first?
Yeah. I think that sometimes, it can be kind of a semantic difference, but I think it's an important one for us as people who want to be active in making this country the country were meant to be, to really think about what is our job, what's our task, what should we be doing.
Tell me about your grandmother's legacy, for you personally, as a child, as you were raised, and how that helped form you through your childhood into your young womanhood, into what you do today.
Well, first of all, my disclaimer is I'm not a historian, and I was a preteen. I was almost 13 when my grandmother died, so I knew her as a child. And so I had that experience. That was my personal experience, but I also knew her through my mother's and other members of my family who spoke to me about her. She's very important to me. I think I was always very aware, not only that I'm named after her, but that I look very much like her. And I have always looked like her from the time I was a child, which was sometimes confusing. People are not always kind, or very sensitive to what a child hears. And so in that regard, in terms of appearance, I grew into being, appreciating the look-alike status. That was something I had to grow into. But from the start, my personal remembrances of her are of a person who was a superb listener to me as a child. I have never forgotten that. I also remember what a good listener she was to guests around the dinner table in the summers when we'd go to Valkill. There were always a lot of people at that dinner table. But she was attentive to each one, including me. And that impressed me so, because how are you ever going to learn to express what you think if you aren't able to listen to what other people think? So that was a fundamental lesson. that has stuck with me, that is from her. There was always a recognition that she was a busy person, and that was a good thing. And so I grew up thinking that's the way you ought to live. You needed to make good use of your time here and take every opportunity that you could to join a group, do things that were important, also enjoy your family. And I remember her enjoying the surroundings of her home, so a sense of place. The will to be helpful, I think that has been formative for my life. I may not have always been clear what I was good at, but if I could start with the question, where can I be helpful, that helped me discover what my strengths were. And I suspect, I've always felt that I followed the same path that she followed of self-discovery. And that was a legacy from her, kind of a strength, a wind up my back that helped me get through those times of not knowing who I was or what I was supposed to be doing. And her asking, what's the fundamental thing? What can you do to be helpful? Was helpful to me to figure myself out.
David mentioned that she held 300 and some odd press conferences in her tenure as First Lady. She wrote a daily column in the newspaper. She wrote a monthly magazine column. She hosted a weekly radio show. That's like 2 gigs right there without even the First Lady duties worked in. Sometimes she was open when she disagreed with your grandfather about some of his policy positions. And I found it so interesting that in a way, the traditional role of a First Lady today, I can't imagine the fallout if we had a First Lady that was hosting radio shows and holding press conferences, pointing out her policy differences with her husband, the president. Did she see herself as a feminist, as we would think of it today, or was that an evolution for her?
As I understood it, it was an evolution. I mean, you can read that. We're going to hear later on from Dr. Alita Black, who will tell us all about how she evolved. But I came upon her at a point where she was more aware, I think, of women's rights and of it as a policy issue. At the same time, she was who she was. I mean, that was how I learned what it was to be a feminist. It was to be who you are. And so I can't say that we ever had conversations about feminism. I think she was aware of that language and used it and participated. But for me, it was the kind of life that she led and the decisions that she made and the things that she said, well, this is important, I'm just going to keep working at this, that demonstrated what it meant to be a feminist and to use your whatever attributes, stature, power that you have to support others who perhaps aren't quite at that place.
Where do you think we are today in this conversation, both about feminism and gender equity? I know many young women who very aggressively shy away from the term feminism.
Yeah, I think, and I have 2 daughters who are around 40, and I don't hear them using the term either, but their lives are very different than in my life, and certainly their grandmothers or their great-grandmothers. So I think it's partly that all of that work was done, and then the topic became larger, and so the younger generation is just using a different language, but they want the same things. And maybe that's our struggle, is to find that common terminology, that we can have conversations about, maybe it's just clearer to talk about equity than about feminism. Maybe that, it certainly is still a topic in some societies, but here in this country, perhaps we need to establish a common language so that we can move forward, because the job isn't done yet.
What does stepping forward in gender equity look like? And through the prism of the work that you're doing at Goodwill, give me that perspective.
Well,
What
I would say
success look
through
like?
any of the work that I've done, meant for me, when I had the opportunity to assemble a staff, or put people in executive positions, or I was very aware of making sure not only that we had the very best person in that job, but to make sure that there were an equal number of women vying for that position as men, and that was part of the voice that would end up being heard was a woman's voice. At Goodwill, we find, where our clients are people who are struggling to find stability in their lives, so they have a lot of challenges in their life. We find that women suffer a lot of anxiety. These are generally women who've not been employed. They are looking for employment in order to bring stability, so they're poor. And through them, I see how far we still need to come. It is easier to convince an employer to take on a person who needs supports if they are a man. And so our job is to work very hard to convince that employer that if the person can do the job, it doesn't matter if they're a man or a woman.
Why is that? What's the reason the employer will give you for being less comfortable with taking on a woman who needs help?
It's not articulated. It's just, we're generally asking employers to open up a bit, to suspend some of their normal ways that they make a decision about a new employee, and to take a chance on somebody who hasn't had a stable background. And they just will choose, that doesn't feel like a fit. That's the kind of that tenor underneath stuff that doesn't get spoken, that I think is still very much there, and why the work of feminism isn't done, because there's still that underlying ripple somewhere out there that says a woman can't do everything that a man can do.
How do you have these conversations about gender equity that don't just include people in the conversation who are in the church already and part of the choir? They're often very uncomfortable conversations, and sometimes, and I see these in conversations about race as well, people have two reactions. Either they roll their eyes like, oh God, this one again, or they become very physically uncomfortable about it. But to me, it seems the only way to change some of those numbers is to have a conversation with people who are not converted, or maybe not even ever used to having that conversation. How do you navigate that?
Well, I think it actually starts with listening, starts with understanding the person you're trying to talk with, and finding that way in, that story, that personal story that you can share, that sort of opens it up some. I think that's one thing that we can do, is sharpen our communication skills and just learn how to start conversations, to ask people to tell us about themselves. And from there, look for openings to share about ourselves or about somebody else, some kind of example that might might open up their thinking process. But also, and I feel like I got this from my grandmother. I can't remember a specific moment, but that notion of courage, sometimes you just have to take a deep breath and say, I don't look at it the same way that you are, or that I used to, or whatever. But that courage to step out and say, it's important for us to have this conversation right now in a grocery line, or when you're picking up kids from school, or wherever you find yourself.
Because they're trapped in the line, and then you have them.
Right. Yeah.
How much do you think data and records is critical, and just gathering information is critical to this conversation? There was an interesting study, and I can't cite it specifically, where they asked men to gauge how much they talked and women talked in a classroom. And when men thought that the amount that they were speaking and that women were speaking was equal, the men actually spoke 56% of the time. The time when men spoke 56% of the time, they thought the women had spoken more. And when men spoke 70% of the time, they thought it was equal. Huh. And I just thought it had some tremendous insights. I think sometimes data around things like that can provide tremendous insights for some people who sort of are open to hearing it, about an imbalance in equality and equity. How much do you use and talk about data, and who do you invite into that conversation?
Well, data is often enlightening. It tells us things that you just wouldn't think is true. So that's helpful, but I also think that it's sometimes off-putting. We used to say in business, data will set you free. You can rely on data, but a lot of people, I think, get kind of bored with it. They think it's somehow a trick question was asked or something. But the notion of documents and records is so powerful because they are real people with names, and they are stories that are interesting. It's like reading a novel. And I've found, especially in archives and collections like that, when you can read letters that somebody wrote, and often they are letters that women wrote. And it's a whole new perspective for a person who never thought about what did the women think. It can really open up a person's understanding of life.
Who do you invite into that conversation? If we're going to have real conversations that move the needle on gender equality and gender equity, who needs to be at the table for that conversation? And what's the conversation? Is it about childcare? Is it about work? What is it?
Yes. I think it has to be an active conversation, and the conversation has to happen everywhere. Certainly, informally with people that we live with our children, even important conversations with people in a generation older. There aren't too many of those anymore, but on both sides of your generation, I think that's important to have that informal conversation. It's also, I think, important in a formal way for institutions to have conversations. This is important. It's important for businesses, places of work, to make those conversations possible. I know at Goodwill, we take the opportunity when something has happened to one of our employees to share it, and to share what our values are around that, and to have that conversation among our employees. We strive for a culture that feels more like family. Not all businesses strive for that culture, but to me, it's important because to me that means that the business is running well. And that's where you can have that conversation.
Many years ago, I think I was anchoring at the Today Show. I used to always ask female CEOs who I'd sit with how they balanced having children and their work. I was starting a family, and I had 4 kids under 4, and I really genuinely was trying to steal some tips from them. And I remember my dad would call me afterwards so mad, and he'd say, "You only ask the female CEOs that. You never ask the men that you should drop that question altogether." Is gender equality not asking anybody? Is it asking everybody? Is it changing things so that the question's irrelevant and it's a specious question because balance is not so hard for people? What is true winning in this?
Well, I think the situation we're in now, because we're not at the place where it's not irrelevant. It is relevant, but I think it has to be relevant for everybody. And it's not, we don't have all the solutions in place. I think that's still an active field of endeavor. And, I remember having, or being in that conversation at Boeing once when the first woman was named to a senior executive position. And so all the women wanted to meet with her to say, what do we need to do to get to where you are? And her answer it was almost infamous because it was, you got to give up a lot. And I tell you, that wasn't satisfactory. That wasn't what women wanted to hear. They wanted that tip. They wanted that solution. When we look at what women have been asked to do traditionally as their exclusive purview, and we realize that's important work, it is very successfully shared by more than just one woman in a family. I think that there's a lot of good that can come from simply not so much talking about this isn't fair to women, but it's not fair to any of us. It's not building the kind of society that leads us to being better at community, better at society, better at helping one another. And so we can continue to have that kind of goal-focused conversation.
If anybody has a card that they have filled out, I'd love for you to pass it into the center aisle here, and you guys can pass it on the edge here. I'm going to have someone come and grab everybody's card. So walk me through very tangibly, what does gender equity and gender equality look like on a day-to-day basis? What is the change for the woman? What would have to happen so that we get there? You have a publication that talks about rewriting the rules.
The Roosevelt Institute
and
does,
what are
yes.
what are the rules, and how do you rewrite them so that we actually are solving this challenge?
So that's about the role of public policy in helping to change systemic barriers to groups of people in poverty. How do we rewrite the economic rules? How do we rewrite the racial rules to get at that subtle drumbeat of exclusion?
So policy certainly is one arm
Yes.
of how you kind of change and create gender equality. What does it look like?
I think it means that we need to examine as a society things that are relevant to us today, even in this moment in time that this country is going through. What are the issues that keep some people in poverty and enable a very few to be very, very privileged? What are those things in finance, in the workplace, in housing, that need to be addressed, that need to be looked at to make sure that we're not building in barriers, even in a program that is meant to be helpful. At Goodwill, we see a lot of people, a lot of women who are existing on the margins because of their own instability, but they're just barely holding on because of various programs that help them get enough food, have housing. But the process they have to go through to get those benefits is demeaning and difficult. And how do we rewrite those rules so that those people are built up as people instead of made to feel that they're somehow less than worthy?
Do you think we get there? I mean, what has to happen? I know, obviously, I think we've had a lot of conversations for good, for bad, for very bad this election cycle.
Yeah.
Do you think that we're starting to confront some of these issues in real ways where we'll really see change? Or 10 years later, are we back on the stage having the same conversation?
I would hope 10 years from now we would be at a very different place. I think the younger, there's so much good thinking in the younger generation that I think we can build on.
Yes, shout out to our younger generation who's here.
We can jumpstart because it's the younger generation that are really coming up with very good ideas about how to get there faster. If we pay attention to them, we're human beings, so we're not perfect. So I think we're always going to be talking about how to get better. But we have resources. We have records to tell us how people worked through thinking before. We can learn from that. And we have, as I say, a lot of people of goodwill who I think can be leaders.
I hope we hear from some of our younger generation who are whooping in the back. In the questions, I hope that you filled out some of those cards. Why don't we bring those cards up so I can start taking questions from the audience? Thank you, appreciate that.